He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
So this thing is about 500 times more powerful than the LHC, which means that it would probably need the same amount of energy that it takes to sort of power the whole city of Hamilton.
But sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible that it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
And by the looks of the proton packs that they have in Ghostbusters, you can only imagine that it would be a synchrotron type of accelerator, given that there seem to be sort of circular parts to their backpacks, which I would imagine are supposed to be these sort of chambers around which the protons circle.
I'm Bryan Crump, and welcome to Sci-Fi Sci-Fact. This is a podcast where we take science fiction's strangest ideas and explore if they actually could happen. And in every episode, we bring in a scientist from New Zealand's McDiarmid Institute to explain the theories behind some of fiction's more fantastic flights of fancy. This week's intersection of science fact and fiction is based on a ghost story, Ghostbusters.
It's just occurred to me we really haven't had a completely successful test of this equipment.
I blame myself.
So do I.
Well, no sense worrying about it now.
Why worry? Each of us is wearing an unlicensed nuclear accelerator on his back.
Yep. Let's get ready. Switch me on.
And here with a scientific take on the science of Ghostbusters and maybe some of the things they use to bust the ghosts is the PhD student in physics at Auckland University, Emily Kendall. Ghostbusters, do you remember when it first came out?
I think when it first came out, I hadn't actually been born. So I remember watching various Ghostbusters films, but to be honest, it was a little bit before my time.
Yeah, I actually introduced Ghostbusters 1 to my son the other day. He quite liked it, although it had dated. Bill Murray's part in particular, my partner also watched it, and I don't know if she'd ever seen it. She said, he's really rather creepy, you know, which I had to acknowledge. And I've always been a Bill Murray fan, but that's not what we want to talk about. We want to talk now the science. We're talking about the science of ghostbusting or ghosts, Emily.
We're talking specifically about the science of the technology that they use in Ghostbusters to sort of obliterate or capture the ghosts. There's not too much that I can tell you about the science of ghosts themselves. So we've got to just focus on the proton packs that they're using in this particular film franchise, which are these sort of supposed to be these backpack type implements that have little particle accelerators inside them and shoot a proton beam at ghosts. Ghosts in the Ghostbusters franchise are supposed to have negative energy. So the idea is that these protons will somehow manage to capture the ghosts.
By negative energy, do you mean that they're made of antimatter?
No, I do not mean that. Well, at least I don't believe that the writers of Ghostbusters meant that. What the idea is, as far as I can understand it from the Ghostbusters wiki, is that the ghosts are supposed to have a negative charge, and the positively charged protons that are being fired at them capture the ghost because of the attractive force between negative and positive charges.
Before I ask you a bit more about that, I'm scratching my head here, especially given I just watched it the other day, Ghostbusters 1. I can't remember any of the characters, not even Bill Murray's character talking. He talked about cats and dogs sleeping together, but I can't remember him talking about a proton pack.
Right. So there was, it sort of initially wasn't mentioned as a proton pack, and I can't remember which of the films or the series they decided to start calling it that, but they're essentially the backpacks that they use with the hose and the sort of handheld hose, which they point toward ghosts. Do you remember those things?
Oh, yeah, I remember them all right. And, they'd send out these rays and, they'd seem to be struggling to hold on to them, Like they were
Yes.
holding a fire hose at really high pressure. It was kind of like that. And then
That's what
they
it looks
point them
like.
at the ghosts, and the beams were not supposed, the initial plot driving device was don't cross the beams or bad things happen.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yes.
And
Beam crossing was a big plot point.
yeah, it was. But we won't get to that just yet because that maybe is too much of a spoiler for those who haven't watched it. But those beams, now, if you actually were able to accelerate particles, how are they separating, or how could you separate the protons from the neutrons? Because I assume you need atoms with both, and you need to get the protons off the neutrons to send them down into this thing that then points a beam towards the ghost.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, what they have in the Ghostbusters lore and what is physically possible are two sort of different things. What they suggest in the Ghostbusters franchise is that these proton packs actually consist of accelerators which collide positrons, and those positron collisions form the proton beam. But that's actually, you mentioned antimatter before. Positrons are an example of antimatter. They are the antimatter particle, the pair for the electron. So unfortunately, two positrons colliding doesn't ever make a proton. So that sort of initial approach to these proton beams isn't going to work. But you mentioned sort of separating, you said protons from neutrons.
Yeah.
Actually, you can make it a bit easier than that. You can separate just protons from electrons. And the reason is that one of the most abundant elements around us is hydrogen. And hydrogen, the sort of most common isotope of hydrogen, just has a single proton in the middle and an electron orbiting around it. So there are actually no neutrons in the nucleus.
Really?
So you can actually, yeah. And this is what they use in big particle accelerators in scientific labs. They actually take hydrogen, which is just that one proton and one electron, and with a very strong electric field, you can strip the electron off and leave just the proton.
Can I, before I ask you more of that, how is it that hydrogen is stable when it doesn't have a neutron? Do most hydrogen atoms actually have a proton and a neutron as well as one electron?
So when you're talking about stability, often you're referring to electric charge, but the proton is positively charged and the electron is negatively charged.
Yes.
The neutron actually has no electrical charge. So the neutron isn't there to sort of stabilize things in an electromagnetic sense. The neutrons are essentially just sort of, well, for our purposes here, redundant bits of the nucleus. So the hydrogen is perfectly stable without a neutron and actually becomes less stable if you start packing neutrons in there. So there are other isotopes of hydrogen, such as deuterium, which has a neutron in the middle of it, and tritium, which has two neutrons as well. So there are other isotopes, but the neutrons aren't required for stability.
Getting back to those protons that you can create on their own by stripping a proton from the electron of some hydrogen isotopes, or one in particular, and that's what they do in the particle accelerators. What happens then? Would you then create a beam if you had enough of these protons stripped from their hydrogen electrons?
Yep. So the first thing that you have to do once you've stripped the protons is you have to accelerate them and focus them into a beam. And the acceleration part usually takes place in what we call a linear accelerator. And a linear accelerator is sort of a long, straight tube which uses an electrical field to just give them a momentum kick. And that happens before the protons then get fed off into a different type of accelerator, which we call a synchrotron. And by the looks of the proton packs that they have in Ghostbusters, you can only imagine that it would be a synchrotron type of accelerator, given that there seem to be sort of circular parts to their backpacks, which I would imagine are supposed to be these sort of chambers around which the protons circle.
When you have an accelerator, it's generally the size of I think at the smallest, a pretty large rugby field or something like that. And the Large Hadron Collider is about the size of a small country. How's that all going to fit in a backpack, realistically?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Realistically, the answer is it wouldn't. So there's the thing is that it might be a sort of argument about semantics here, but the accelerator part is not all you actually need, because there are a whole lot of other bits and pieces like vacuum pumps and high voltage power supplies and all of that sort of extraneous material that's really going to bulk up your accelerator. So even if the accelerator or synchrotron itself is small, there's all of that additional peripheral material which is really going to increase the size. And so realistically, the sort of smallest proton accelerators that you get are those that you use in hospitals for proton beam therapy. And those ones require at least the space of a room to sort of have all of the setup and everything.
Okay.
So to get it onto the size of a backpack is a little bit of a big ask.
What do we use proton beams to cure?
There's this concept of ionizing radiation. And ionizing radiation is essentially sending a beam, and it might be protons, it could be electrons, it could be gamma radiation or X-rays, for example, at human tissue and killing that tissue by essentially knocking electrons off stable atoms within the cells. So what you use it for in things like cancer therapy is essentially you focus this beam of protons toward a tumor inside somebody's body, and you try and focus it precisely so that the damage is incurred only in that particular region and leaves all the healthy cells alone.
Yes.
So basically what it does is smashes up the atoms within the cancerous tumor and destroys the DNA within each cancer cell, making them then unable to replicate.
And that's such an important challenge of cancer treatment, is how to treat the cancer without killing the patient, or at least making the patient extremely sick.
Exactly, yeah.
Would a proton beam look like the beams in Ghostbusters, though? Would we be able to see it even?
That is a really good question. And to answer that question, you have to think about what it means to see something. So human vision uses only photons. And so if you have a beam of just protons going in a straight line, technically you wouldn't see anything because there are no photons coming from that beam towards your eye.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So in order to actually see the proton beam or the effects of it, you need some interactions happening which would generate photons. So some things, what might happen is if you have these protons bashing into molecules within the air, then as those interactions take place, you could get sort of essentially sparks of light that potentially could be visible, but it entirely depends on the frequency of the photons that come out of those collisions. And more often than not, they wouldn't actually be within the frequency band that humans can see. So other than the sort of possibility of protons bashing into various molecules along the way, or potentially if you had a very strong magnetic field to bend the beam, in which case you would get some what's called synchrotron radiation coming off, then there's not really any way to see the beams, and certainly not in the way that it's presented in Ghostbusters, where you've sort of got this bright blue sort of glowing beam.
Which looks great on the big screen, I might add.
Oh, it does.
Emily, you've already pointed out that the space that they'd need to get all this technology in so they could fire a proton beam would at least have to be the size of a room, not a backpack. What about the energy they'd need to do this?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well. And in Ghostbusters, they don't really specify how powerful these proton packs are supposed to be. But what they do mention is a frequency, and it's only mentioned once, and you've just got to sort of, I suppose, use creative license to interpret what they mean. But what they say in the franchise is that the maximum power setting for the proton packs is 500,000 megahertz. So the issue with that statement is that megahertz is not actually a unit of power or a unit of energy. So to interpret that, we'd have to sort of make some assumptions. And what I sort of on a back of the envelope calculation with a few assumptions, if we assume that 500,000 megahertz refers to the number of protons which collide with a target or a ghost per second, then what that means is that 500,000 megahertz becomes 5 times 10 to the power of 11 collisions per second. And to put that into perspective, the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which is the biggest proton accelerator in the world, only achieves about 10 to the 9 collisions per second. So this thing is about 500 times more powerful than the LHC, which means that it would probably need the same amount of energy that it takes to sort of power the whole city of Hamilton. And that's a little bit unrealistic.
This is such a common refrain in sci-fi, sci-fact. Maybe you could do this if you had a source of really compact, portable energy. But again, how you got to have something the size of a nuclear power plant on your back, and you got to be able to carry it around on your back. Is there anything that could create or provide that sort of energy that you could carry around in your backpack?
Not that you could carry around in your backpack. They do, in the movies, they do mention the energy pack of the cell, the energy source of these backpacks. And what they say is that each pack's energy cell has a half-life of 5,000 years. Because they use the word half-life, it indicates that they're talking about radioactive sources. But then you have to question, well, what exactly are they doing with that radioactive source? And if they did use a radioactive source to act as a sort of nuclear fuel in a reactor, then you would need a source that had a critical mass which is low enough to fit on a backpack. And the critical mass is basically the minimum amount of mass that you need to sustain a chain reaction, like the type that you get in a reactor. And because they've said that the energy cell has a half-life of 5,000 years, looking at what isotopes have half-lives of about that long, you come across curium-246, which is the closest to 5,000 years in a half-life. But the critical mass of curium-246 is about 70 kilograms. So it's not feasible to put a 70 kilogram lump of isotope on everybody's backpack.
I'll tell you what, though, that's closer than I thought we might be. I thought you were going to say about 70 tons. 70 kilograms. Well, I mean, some people do carry about, don't they, in army training? I mean, a heavy pack for me, is about 20 kg. But, somebody really, really strong, like super bulky, not like any of those guys in Ghostbusters 1, however, might be able to carry a 70 kg load, as long as everything else is pretty light, though.
The 70 kilograms is only the minimum mass of that particular isotope that's required to sustain the reaction. And it doesn't include all of the peripheral technology around that to create a reactor. So the reactor itself would then be the weight of, a substantially sized building. So that then would be
right, okay.
The main limitation.
We are really stretching it again. We're stretching it all the time. Negatively charged ectoplasmic entities. That's what they call the ghosts, right?
Yes.
Does such a thing actually exist? A negatively charged ectoplasmic entity? Or are those just words that the very clever scriptwriters came up with?
Well, ectoplasm is just a supernatural term, so it's not really a scientific term.
Okay.
But negative charge is something that's well understood within physics. And the issue with something that's sort of floating around like a ghost that has a negative charge that doesn't sort of change with time is that it's very unstable. And you can sort of compare it to what happens with lightning. So what happens when there's a storm is that the friction within storm clouds generates this charge displacement, and you get a space between a negatively charged and a positively charged area. And that is unstable. And in order to fix that situation, you get these big bolts of lightning, which are essentially just charge transfer to make everything neutral again. And
that's a problem with the ghosts, isn't it? I mean, you'd never get to the point where you could corner them in a room in a hotel and get slimed because, and that's another question actually. What the hell is slime when it comes to a ghost? But they would have discharged that charge, wouldn't they? They would have touched something and zap. There'd be lightning, and they wouldn't be negatively charged anymore.
Exactly. So they would struggle to maintain a static negative charge, especially if they're going through walls and things where there are plenty of atoms to release that charge and neutralize the ghost. So having a sort of high negative charge on one object for a sustained period of time is also quite hard to imagine.
Could the slime be something which stops them from discharging?
No, not really. But again, I can't speculate as to what the slime actually consists of. But some of the sci-fi writers might have a clever solution to that.
It looks funny in the movies. Crossing the beams. Don't cross the beams until you're dealing with Armageddon, in which case you do cross the beams. Sorry, spoiler alert, too late. What? Now, is there anything, if we got those proton beams and fired them and fired them at each other, what would happen? Right.
So in the movies, they talk about this thing called total protonic reversal, and that's what you're supposed to be avoiding. And if you cross the beams, you end up in this total protonic reversal situation and huge explosions and, all sorts of catastrophes. But in the real world, if you actually are just firing two proton beams at each other, then you're essentially replicating what happens inside existing particle accelerators. So particle accelerators like the Large Hadron Collider deliberately fire proton beams at each other, and they do this so that they can then study the products of the scattering processes when they collide. And when they study these products, they are able to sort of test the standard model of particle physics and test the very precise behaviors of different fundamental particles. And they use this sort of technique as well to discover new particles like the Higgs boson, which was discovered a few years ago. So it doesn't actually do anything extremely interesting when the two proton beams collide from a sci-fi point of view. And unless you're a particle physicist, you probably wouldn't be too interested in it either.
It doesn't create many black holes, does it?
No, it does not.
Oh well. What happens to the hydrogen that you've stripped the protons and electrons from? What's left behind?
Well, you've stripped the electrons from the protons, right? So you're getting rid of the electrons and then keeping the protons and firing them off. So what you do with the electrons is sort of up to you. They're no longer useful to you, and you just need to discharge that negative energy somehow.
Does it just become energy? Because, if you've got hydrogen at room temperature, it's a gas. What does it end up being when you've removed the protons?
If you just have electrons, they don't exist as a gas. They just exist as charge built up on something. So if they are in a vacuum, then you essentially just have an empty chamber full of electrons bouncing off each other. If they are not in a vacuum, then they're going to quickly go and ionize things, which means that they smash into other particles, and those particles then transfer charge. And it's the same situation as the ionizing radiation we were talking about before.
Why do we speed protons around particle accelerators and not neutrons or electrons? Is that because we can't?
Well, there are actually particle accelerators for all sorts of different fundamental particles. So there are electron accelerators, and there are, for that matter, even positron accelerators. Protons are useful because they're quite heavy, and the physics of protons is reasonably well understood. The other thing is that they're just so abundant. I mean, if you're looking at the matter that is all around us, we've got as you rightly said, protons, neutrons, and electrons to choose from. And one of the easiest things to do then is just to collide protons. But you do also have the other sort of fundamental particles being accelerated as well for different scientific research purposes.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sci-Fi Sci-Fact, hosted by me, Bryan Crump, produced by Andrew Robertson, and of course, made possible thanks to the incredible knowledge of those brilliant scientists at the MacDiarmid Institute. You can find more episodes of Sci-Fi Sci-Fact on the RNZ podcast page. RNZ's podcasts are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and iHeartRadio, or pretty much wherever you find your podcasts. And make sure to follow us so you don't miss out on any new episodes.